Welcome to our final week of Faculty Perspectives for 2020. I hope throughout this last few weeks you've begun to really understand the breadth and depth of the research interests and work of our top-notch faculty here at the University of Oregon. We've tried to highlight the ways in which undergraduates can not only learn from faculty at the UO, but also share the ways that students can be part of the huge body of research done at the University of Oregon each year. In just a moment, I will introduce you to our presenter for this session, but of course, I must remind you of two important items. First, remember that our presenter will answer your questions live on camera in the last segment of this program. If you're a student watching in Zoom, use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we will be sure to answer those questions here today. Secondly, students who are watching should also be sure to visit community.uoregon.edu after we're done with this program and submit your reflection as part of your introduction requirements. As part of those introduction requirements, you will need to complete and submit 10 separate reflections on faculty perspectives. At this time, Associate Professor of Earth Sciences Matthew Polizzotto, he told me how to say it, Professor Polizzotto will present this week's Environment and Climate Change track on his question, how do we know if our water is and will be safe? Welcome, Dr. Polizzotto.
Thank you very much, Cora. It's great to be here.
It's all yours.
Excellent. Well, I appreciate the introduction, and I'm happy to get to talk with everyone out there. I look forward to welcoming you on campus, either virtually or in person when that time comes. I am an associate professor in the Department of Earth Sciences, and I run the Soil and Water Lab at the University of Oregon. And my research is centered around kind of the pressing challenges that we face around the globe and close to home about how do we know when our water is safe to drink and when it is safe to use for a wide range of purposes, and then how do we know that it will continue to be safe? How can we kind of understand and come up with information that allows us to make smart decisions about using our water resources? So this work is really highlighted by this kind of the great global challenge of accessing safe drinking water around the world. It's kind of shocking to realize that over 600 million people don't have access to what's deemed improved drinking water. And improved means it's water that's likely to be safe based on how that water is accessed. If you look here in this map shown on this slide, you see different countries of the world shaded by the numbers of people who don't have access to improved drinking water. And you can see in many countries, particularly in Africa and parts of Asia, many people don't have access to improved drinking water. But the problem is much more challenging than that. In fact, if you look to that picture shown of a domestic well that's being used, that's a picture from Cambodia, that well would be considered improved. And so in that tally of how many people have improved drinking water, the people shown in that picture would be counted as having improved water. But that water isn't safe. That's actually contaminated with naturally occurring arsenic, which can cause a whole range of health problems, including cancer and death. It's been estimated that around 5.2 billion people in the world use safely managed drinking water. But that means, since we have a global population of 7.2 billion people, that around 2 billion people do not use safe drinking water. And that is the motivation for the work that we do in my research group. Now we can say, well, that's a global problem, and that's really, really tragic. But it's not just global. This is a local problem, too. In the United States, a recent study showed that about 76.9 million people out of 330 million people in the U.S. Consume water where that has been violated the Safe Drinking Water Act at some part of a year. That's pretty staggering to know that roughly a third or 1/4 of all the people in the U.S. at some time in the year are drinking unsafe water. So this problem is one that can be close to home as well. In my lab, the overarching goal of our research program is really to try to help better predict, manage, and respond to contaminants that threaten human and environmental health. And this is a really big challenge, both for promoting safety of people and safety of resources, but it's also really a challenge to kind of figure out how to manage. There are many different types of water resources. There are thousands of different contaminants. These can change in terms of their concentrations over space and over time. And in our lab, we try to kind of figure out what controls different contaminants that are of priority. In this slide, you see some pictures of people in my lab group. The two people who are in pictures by themselves are undergraduates who are currently in my lab. So it highlights the kind of opportunities for undergraduate research, both in my lab and at the University of Oregon. And also, I want to point out how kind of getting different perspectives and bringing people into my lab with different backgrounds is really paramount for the work that we do. As we think about these complex problems, it's really vital to have different points of view, different perspectives. And that's going to come in, I'll highlight that more as we go on in this talk. So today, the things I'll touch on, I'll talk about my journey, how I got here and how I got interested in doing the work that I do, how we conduct research in my lab, a couple snapshots of some of the things that we're working on right now, and then try to tie that together and think about how the research can really inform my teaching and then community engagement. We can see that kind of understanding water resources, not just an issue for a scientist to think about, it's something that we all have to face in our everyday lives. And then I'll conclude the talk talking about how you can engage with this work or how you can become engaged with research in general across the university. So I'll start with my journey. So here I am as a little kid here, ready to take on the world. I grew up in Massachusetts, and I really kind of grew into New England. I loved being outside. Here is the places where I'd like to explore. These are the White Mountains of New Hampshire. Now, if you're from New England, these are big mountains. If you are from Oregon, you would laugh in the face of these mountains. But nevertheless, this is where I grew up, and it got me really interested in being outside and understanding kind of the environment. But I came from a pretty small town, and when I went to college, I didn't really have a good idea of what you could study in college. And so I knew I studied chemistry and biology and physics in high school, and I kind of liked sciences, and I kind of liked chemistry. So I went to college. I'll be a chemistry major. And then on a whim, I decided it was my sophomore year. I decided I'm going to take an earth science class because I really like being outside. Let's see what that's about. And as soon as I took that class, I became hooked. I was like, this is how I can kind of explore my love of science and also my love of the outdoors, and really try to build that into kind of an academic program and also a career. And so I got involved in research as an undergraduate. I got to do some really neat things. One of the projects I worked on was studying different chemical signatures in deep sea hydrothermal vents. And this was really neat because we were trying to look at life signatures and look at analogs for places in this solar system to try to think about how life originated and whether it could originate in other places. And that was really, really cool. I got to do some really kind of interesting kind of explorations. I went up to northern Canada to do some paleomagnetic research, and that was a really amazing experience. I got to fly around on a helicopter and camp and collect samples to try to kind of understand the history, the geologic history of the locations where we're at. And this was really interesting, and it was certainly really fun. But over time, I had this nagging question. So I was really curious, and I had kind of wanted to know how things worked. But I also, this nagging question that was like, well, so what? Like, so how can we use this to kind of for the betterment of society? And so as I went kind of from undergraduate to graduate school, I tried to kind of merge my interest in earth sciences and kind of chemical processes with kind of the big question of, well, so what? And so I started studying what's known as history's largest mass poisoning, and that's of arsenic in well water in South and Southeast Asia. And I showed this picture before, the picture on the left, showing a well that is contaminated with arsenic. You can't smell it, you can't taste it, you can't see it, And over time, after 10 or 15 years of drinking water with high levels of arsenic, it leads to a wide range of health problems that are manifested, in this case, by lesions on hands and your feet, but also can lead to things like paralysis and blindness, cancers, and death. And it's shocking to recognize that 150 million people every day are slowly poisoned by arsenic in their well water in South and Southeast Asia. And so this kind of got me really passionate, and I wanted to figure out, well, why is this? Why is there so much arsenic in the well water? And to do that, I thought about this from an earth sciences perspective. And so we can look at the kind of the South and Southeast Asian region. This image here highlights the Himalayas in the Himalayan mountains in the big backdrop. You can see some traces of some of the major river systems of the world, the Ganges River, the Brahmaputra River that run through India and Bangladesh. And throughout that flat-lying areas, there's hundreds or millions of wells that have been installed to try to create access to safe drinking water. But tragically, so much of this water is contaminated with arsenic, and that's why it's led to these big public health challenges. So as an earth scientist, you say, well, let's understand these kind of the earth science processes, what's happening in the environment. So you can start by thinking about, well, here are the headwaters of these big river systems that are driving these landscapes. This is a picture of the Ganges River in the Himalayas, kind of where it's starting out. And then we can move down these river systems. This is a picture of the Mekong River in Cambodia, where I also did a lot of work. And we can think about how water is cycling through these systems and kind of funneling underground to become kind of groundwater that people use for their well water. And we can look at all the bounds on the systems, like the kind of natural areas that might be kind of controlling water flow and might be controlling some kind of chemical cycling within these systems. And we can try to make models for how arsenic can get into the water and how it cycles underground to ultimately contaminate well water. And we can think about, then we can start digging holes and look at, well, what does underground look like? These are pictures of soils and sediments kind of at the near surface in Cambodia. And you see just by digging 20 feet down or so, you see vast kind of heterogeneity in the subsurface, and there are different chemical reactions that are taking place in each of these different layers, and that manifests in the different colors that you see in the picture. And we can even get even more excited. We did just take a whole bunch of soil or sediment in your hand, and you can see vast diversity in colors and shapes of these different minerals. And before you know it, I'm on this intellectual quest, curiosity program, trying to figure out what's going on. And then before I know it, just understanding these scientific processes takes so much. You have to think about things in so many different ways. But then on top of that, of course, is the real key, which is that the motivation here is people. And so how do we think about how people kind of interact with these? We can understand all the science we want to understand where arsenic is coming from, why it's there, whether it will change over time, but that does nothing to kind of change the potential exposure to people. And so people are drinking water. And so how can there be, what are solutions to solve? People need water. Is there a better water option? What is the interest in a person changing their water source? How feasible is that? What does that cost? These are things that we have to think about. And then on top of that, water is not just used for drinking, it's used for irrigation. Roughly 1/3 of the world's population uses rice as their kind of staple food. And throughout South and Southeast Asia, many rice fields are irrigated with well water that also has arsenic. And so arsenic goes into the soil and it goes into the rice plant, decreasing rice yields and creating more exposure routes to people. And then ultimately, we can think about how kind of this people can accommodate some of these challenges. What are the solutions? How can we address these different challenges? So right away, we take this kind of scientific problem, these questions. Where is arsenic coming from, and what processes, what chemical and physical and biological processes are controlling it, and why is it where it is, and will that change? And then we can see an ever-expanding set of questions once we really think about, well, how do we solve a problem? So after graduate school, thinking about these things, I wanted to kind of understand, well, what can we do about this? I worked in the U.S. Agency for International Development as a water quality advisor. The U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, is the kind of the development arm of the U.S. government. It's under the State Department. After I worked there, I went to the Department of Soil Science at North Carolina State University. I worked there for 7 years, and then 3 years ago, I came to the Department of Earth Sciences in the University of Oregon, and that's where I've begun the Soil and Water Lab that I lead. So when we think about kind of how we conduct our research, there's lots of different things that we kind of think about. Here's a picture of one of my graduate students digging a hole in Italy for a short course that she was taking about processes that impact chemicals in the environment. But as I mentioned earlier, our goal is really to kind of help better predict, manage, and respond to contaminants that threaten human health. And we do this in a couple of ways in my lab. We're really focused on kind of well water quality and how water in different land uses, whether that be agricultural use, domestic use, or industrial use, can impact water quality issues. We also think about how processes evolve over landscapes and how that impacts water quality issues. And that can really impact how different chemical concentrations, contaminant concentrations, can change over space and time. And we think all about this with kind of the great complexity of the environment. I showed you some slides earlier about kind of just when you dig a hole, you see that the properties of the material underneath the ground change. They change as you go downward, and they change as you go across landscapes. And this impacts chemical and other contaminant distributions across the environment. And these are things that we try to all integrate to kind of understand where water quality problems are coming from and how we can predict whether they'll change in the future, and then ultimately how we can manage those threats. And so what we do is we try to use an integrated and iterative research approach. Ultimately, we start by making analyses in the field. We'll make measurements about where different contaminants are and what their concentrations are. We also can do experiments in the field to try to test whether those concentrations of contaminants will change given different perturbations to the system. But then because the field, the environment is so heterogeneous, it's really hard to kind of constrain the processes that take place. And so what we do then is we take samples from the environment and we bring them into the laboratory, and we do different types of laboratory experiments to really test hypotheses and figure out what are the main drivers of contaminant concentrations. What chemical reactions are taking place? What biological processes are taking place? What are the physical limits on different chemical and contaminant concentrations that might be in the environment? And then we supplement this work with different types of advanced analytical approaches, like different types of spectroscopy and micrometry. When I describe what I do, sometimes I say, I X-ray dirt. And that's sometimes what we do to try to look at what are the contaminants in the soil and in the sediment, and what are their forms, and how risky might they be, and what is their potential that they could ultimately contaminate water in important reservoirs that we rely on. And so with that framework, I'll give you a couple snapshots of some of our current research projects. We have a number of different things going on in the lab, and I'll highlight a few different things that are kind of at the forefront and ongoing. So I have one graduate student, Fatai, shown here, who is interested in studying chromium in water. And if anyone has ever seen Erin Brockovich, you might know that there's different forms of chromium. In one case, there's chromium-3, trivalent chromium, that's beneficial. In fact, if you take a vitamin, it's very likely that there'll be chromium-3 in it, because it's a nutrient that we can use for for healthy living. However, in the environment, and if that changes from chromium-3 to chromium-6, which is termed hexavalent chromium, that chromium becomes very toxic and can cause a range of cancers. And in Erin Brockovich, that's what this, they talk about this kind of the amount of hexavalent chromium that got into water supplies. And it turns out that there are millions of people in the United States who are routinely exposed to dangerous chromium concentrations in drinking water. This map with the different pink colors highlights locations where high amounts of chromium have been detected. And what you can see is you can go across the US, and in all regions of the country, there are places where there are high chromium concentrations, chromium-6 or hexavalent chromium concentrations in drinking water. And this provides a conduit for exposure to a very toxic contaminant. So Fatai is interested in trying to figure out, well, what causes chromium-6 to be changed from chromium-6 to chromium-3 or vice versa. And this is really important to know in the environment because this then governs the potential for chromium contamination of our water sources. If we know if an environment is susceptible to transformation of chromium from one form to another, we can know if that location is going to have safe water or not. Another project, this was led by a graduate student who just graduated. Her name is Gabby. She's in the middle of the picture shown here. She was looking at arsenic and fluoride contamination of well water in Mexico. Around the world, fluoride is a contaminant in many well water systems. Usually it's naturally derived. That means it came from the rocks and soils beneath the ground without humans putting it in there. But many places have high amounts of fluoride in their well water. Some roughly 200 million people every day drink well water with dangerous concentrations of fluoride. And if you've gone to the dentist, you know that sometimes fluoride is really good. There's a certain amount of fluoride that's good for your teeth. It's good for your bones. But it turns out if you have too much fluoride, it can have really detrimental effects and actually adversely impact your skeletal system. And so you see a lot of health problems in areas where people are drinking high amounts of fluoride in their well water. One place where this is the case is in central Mexico and throughout much of Central and South America. And so Gabby was interested in figuring out where this fluoride and arsenic as well, where they're coming from, whether the concentrations will change, and if those concentrations can change, what causes them to change? And then ultimately using this information to figure out, well, what can be done about this? If we know what's controlling fluoride and where it's coming from underground, then we can install wells in better ways to try to protect against fluoride getting in the well water. And this is pretty vital because many, many millions of people are dependent on these types of resources for their drinking water, highlighted by this image here of Guanajuato, which is in central Mexico, a big city where many people are reliant on well water that is potentially contaminated with fluoride. And the third snapshot, this is of an undergraduate research project that occurred in my lab and is ongoing. This was led by Rachel Cleveland, who's shown in the bottom right picture. She was interested in understanding how kind of human-derived sources of contaminants may impact the environment and ecosystems. And so she studied a abandoned mine in Oregon where mercury was produced. In this location, it's outside of Cottage Grove, for those who might know the Willamette Valley area somewhat well. It's an abandoned mine that was used to produce mercury for roughly 100 years. And the mine is shut down, but because a lot of mine wastes were left in the environment and left at the mine site, they've ultimately kind of moved down and gone throughout the watershed, being transported down little creeks into bigger rivers, into the Willamette River, and ultimately into a big reservoir, the Cottage Grove Reservoir, that's used for both recreation and some water use purposes. And it turns out that this mercury that was in this mine is actually transferred down all throughout this watershed and is deposited within this reservoir. And as a result, mercury has got into the aquatic ecosystems, and there are fish advisories for for fishing and eating fish that have been caught in Cottage Grove Reservoir because mercury has accumulated and then built up in the biotic systems. So Rachel did a whole wide range of things. She went to this mine site and she partnered with people at the EPA and the Oregon Department of the Environment, and she collected samples at the mine site and analyzed them in different ways. And she analyzed them not just from the mine site, but she went throughout the watershed and collected samples in the creeks and in the rivers and in the reservoir to try to figure out how mercury is transported and how its form changes, whether it can go from kind of safe forms or forms that aren't likely to kind of reach people and animals and other organisms, or whether it can be transferred into forms that are much more dangerous. And what she found is that as that sediments were transported from the mine site to the reservoir, they became the mercury in them went into more and more dangerous forms, and that's resulted in this problem where mercury is getting into the aquatic ecosystems, as I mentioned. Rachel is now, in this picture, you see her presenting her research at the University of Oregon Undergraduate Research Symposium. She is also, although she's graduated, she and I are working on a paper that's about to be submitted for publication. So her research as an undergraduate is leading to kind of publishable results that are going to inform other scientists in Oregon and around the world about how mercury is kind of cycles within the environment. My research informs the teaching and outside engagement. I teach several classes at the University of Oregon. I teach an introductory an earth sciences class titled Environmental Geology. And that's where we think about Earth surface processes, how the Earth's surface is shaped, and how they change across landscapes. And then ultimately, as these systems change across landscapes, how do these impact society? We rely on the Earth's surface for so many things, whether that be water to drink or to use for agriculture, whether that be soil that we use for growing food, whether it be ways that we access energy resources. We use the Earth's surface resources in so many different ways. So it's important to understand how these resources are shaped, and then ultimately how that guides how societies can thrive or how they can be threatened if those resources are limited. I teach a course in the Honors College called Environmental Quality and Global Challenges, and here we focus on how water and soil resources are vital for addressing our global challenges like drinking water access, which I've talked about today, but also things like global sanitation, food security, and climate change. And we really try to link science and policy, thinking about once we have this scientific information, how do we use it? How do policymakers use that information? And what information do they need to make better decisions? And finally, I teach a class in the Earth Sciences Department for upper level undergraduates and graduate students, and it's called Geocommunication. And this is where we think about how to communicate our science to broad audiences in written and oral forms. Because I have such a passion for research, I often think about kind of what information do we need for kind of communicating our results. And as a result, what's the best way to teach classes? What are the things that are really important? And so I try to kind of merge those things as I develop my teaching approach. And in my classes, when possible, we try to have active learning modules so that there can be in-class group activities. We really try to focus on critical thinking and quantitative skills rather than just rote memorization. And so we'll do things like paper analyses and sometimes give real-world problem sets where there's no definitive answers. You have to find the information that you need to solve a problem. And you may solve a problem in a really justifiable way, and the student next to you may solve it in a different way that is harder to justify or equally well able to be justified. And so we also work on our communication skills, thinking about elevator speeches, different types of presentations, and analytical writing. And finally, we do a whole range of kind of community engagement where we think about kind of how we develop solutions to water challenges and how we can advocate beyond just scientists so that we can solve problems. We do a range of things, giving trainings to well drillers and environmental health specialists. We put out different types of information sheets that are useful for addressing different problems. We also work with K through 12 students and give public talks as well. And so finally, I'll conclude with how can you engage in research? And so the first thing is to really just be curious, be interested in different things and follow your passions. My route that I took was certainly a wide route. But once you kind of have some things that you're interested, reach out and talk with faculty. I love speaking with undergraduates who are interested in research, and the other faculty I know also love that sorts of things. And there's lots of benefits. You get one-on-one mentoring, some really good institutional support. There you can develop your communication and thinking skills as well. So ultimately, there's lots of benefits in participating in research. And I'll conclude with this kind of thought about that we need you. We need you to solve Earth's social and environmental challenges. And if we think about an environmental problem, we can think about, well, community members are impacted. So say this case, I've shown an image of flooding. This is from Houston. And there are water quality issues and water kind of access issues that resulted. But we also have, and so community members are impacted, but people who use water in different ways are impacted, whether those are farmers or fishers or developers or recreational users. But then we have to understand how things work. And so we have earth scientists, but that's not, we just don't need earth scientists. We need health professionals and chemists. We need to understand the history of systems. So we need environmental engineers to think about how we manage our environment. We need to kind of educate and think about kind of communicating things to the broader public. But then there's other industries that rely on our resources in different ways, businesses, and that kind of provide insight to how we can manage our systems. But then we have lots of public officials and regulators. There's government officials who are thinking about these different problems and thinking about them different ways, and they all have a different say, and they all have different interests and are kind of advocating for different people. We've got advocacy groups like Greenpeace and the National Resource Defense Council. And then we have celebrities. Leonardo DiCaprio is talking at the UN about climate change. And so if you see, I'm an earth scientist, I will speak as loudly as I can, but I'll tell you, my voice is not as loud as Leo's is at the UN. But really, to solve these problems, we need to kind of a really integrated approach where lots of people participate and are thinking about these different things. And so that's where you can come in, whether you're going to be an earth scientist or not, whether you're going to study the environment or not. We all need to kind of work together to address these different problems. And with that, I'll say thank you very much, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you so much. I actually have a few questions, and because I'm going to ask mine first. I'm listening to you talk, and I think about my own upbringing and the communities that I've lived in. And my dad was a municipal bureaucrat all of my life, and so we talked a lot about things like water treatment plants and things like that. Mm-hmm. It was a really exciting childhood. The places that we often lived were places where the water came from quite a distance. And then moving here, I noticed a distinct difference in the taste and the quality of the water, as my water comes from a more local mm-hmm. watershed rather than being sort of piped in across many mm-hmm. fields and freeways and things like that. Do you find in your research that there's a difference in the kinds of contaminants and the amount of contaminants depending on where that water comes from or how close your home is to the resource?
Absolutely. And so kind of the environment where water is sourced is going to impact the potential for different types of contaminants. And that could be due to things that are kind of derived from the earth, like kind of naturally occurring contaminants. I gave some examples of like fluoride and arsenic, which are in the ground already, but they don't show up everywhere. They come in different places around the world. But then also, there are human-derived contaminants. Chromium could be an example, or the mercury. And so how close you are to kind of a potential pollutant source that might be from human-derived causes can also vary. Now, I'll go off on a tangent here because that's what I do, but
Same.
this is also becomes really problematic even over shorter distances. And so if I have a well right here where I am, and then someone has a well just 100 feet away or so, those two wells can have vastly different chemical concentrations and things. And so one could be have toxic chemicals in it, and the other might not. And that's dependent on a whole host of things, some of the things that we just talked about. So it's not just over kind of a big regional or global scale, but even on local scales, there can be very different changes over space in how what the contaminant concentrations may be.
Thank you so much. One of the other questions I had was about the implications of your research findings for local communities. I think of watershed councils and public policy makers and bureaucrats on a municipal level. Do you find that your research has implications, or that you see the results in new policies come out of the kinds of research that you're doing?
Yes, that definitely does happen. And I'll give you an example of a project that actually another undergraduate is working on in my lab right now, which is a local problem. And I didn't put this one in a snapshot, but it's a good one to answer your question. Right now, it turns out in Eugene and Springfield, in a lot of watersheds, there's high amounts of zinc in that water. And that it doesn't really harm people so much, but it impacts kind of aquatic systems and aquatic ecosystems. Well, it turns out that the city of Eugene was really kind of interested in this problem, and they actually contacted the University of Oregon and kind of said, hey, we have this problem. Is there something that can work on it? And that actually filtered down to me. And so my undergraduate is now working with the city of Eugene and city of Springfield and Lane County to try to figure out, well, where is this contaminant coming from? And it turns out one hypothesis is that it's used in kind of very common products that are used for demossing. So a lot of roofs and sidewalks have large amounts of moss, and some chemicals have this particular contaminant in it. And as people use this to get rid of their moss and on their lawns and on their sidewalks and their roofs, it ultimately makes its way into the watershed. And this is something we're working on now. And in fact, you often think about, well, the scientists were going to figure out this problem and then communicate it out to kind of the public officials so that they can do something about it. This went in the reverse direction, where the public officials said, hey, there's this problem. Let's try to figure out what's going on. And maybe we can partner with the university to figure this out. And then currently I have an undergraduate in the lab, Charlotte, who is working on this problem right now.
That's awesome. And it sounds like Charlotte's getting a lot of additional kinds of experiences with that work, and not only research, but working with public officials and interfacing and that kind of communication skill development that's happening with the work that she's doing with them. Absolutely.
We've gone through to different meetings with the officials, and it's really great for me because I just sit back and she does all the talking and kind of describes the work that she's been doing. It's really a pleasure, and she's certainly had some kind of different types of experiences. And she's been doing this work the past over about a year and a half now, and will carry on in the upcoming year. And actually, she's being supported by the University of Oregon, who also has kind of funding resources for undergraduate research.
Awesome. Well, and it sounds like Charlotte's research actually has broader implications for industry, right? So can you talk a little bit about your research? It sounds like it can intersect with a lot of industries that could benefit from research like what you're doing. And I think of the manufacturers of those chemicals, those moss-defeating chemicals. What other industries does your research kind of impact? And where do you find that industry needs more research around what you're doing?
Yeah, so I think there's kind of two main areas where we often work on kind of from from an industrial perspective. One is places that generate different types of waste that might have different types of toxic contaminants in it, or potentially harmful contaminants, and kind of how to store that material or how to dispose of it is something that we think about. Sometimes things can't just go into a landfill, so we have to think about, what are the threats for a given environment, where could those contaminants potentially go, and what are the risks to kind of the kind of local ecosystems, but also then ultimately people's exposure. And so we work with in the past we've worked with different energy producers who generate different types of waste. The other area that we work with is kind of in the agricultural side. And so as we think about growing food, there are a lot of inputs to our food systems, whether those be water or whether those be fertilizers or in some cases things like pesticides or herbicides to help kind of manage growth of our kind of crop development. And so that's another place, because if we have toxic contaminants that are in that water or in that fertilizer or in those kind of different types of pesticides that are prone to migrate through the environment, those could be problematic to ecosystems. They can also be problematic to kind of the crops that are being grown if there's too much of a potential contaminant that can get into that crop, which then causes that crop not to be grown, or can kind of lead to high amounts of that contaminant within our food systems too. And that's something we want to prevent as well.
Thank you. Harrison wants to know, what class do you recommend for a first-year student to take in your field?
Take in my field? Yeah, so great question. There are, in the Earth Sciences department, we have kind of an introductory geology sequence that's Earth 101, Earth 102, and Earth 103. There's one each quarter. And they focus on different aspects of kind of Earth sciences. One is kind of what's happening inside the Earth, what's shaped the Earth. The second one is one that I teach every other year, is about kind of Earth's surface processes, and that's the one that kind of most directly kind of ties to my research. And then the third one is a class on the history of the Earth, and so that talks about how the Earth formed and how it's changed over the past 4.5 billion years, and what types of kind of organisms persisted at different times. So that's one kind of set of sequences. There's also kind of an environmental studies and environmental science program that is kind of intersects with many different departments around campus, and they have some introductory environmental sciences, environmental studies classes as well, and those are really good. And they take, I think, a kind of multidisciplinary approach. And so for the person who asked, depending whether you're interested in more of a kind of geology spin, or whether you're interested in more biology spin, or even a sociology spin, those are good places to go if you're trying to kind of sort out which direction you'd like to take your interest in the environment.
Thank you for that. It sounds like there's a lot of different kinds of students who could also benefit from taking those classes. And if I remember correctly, those are core ed satisfying classes as well, so that all students can use those toward their degree completion, right?
That's right. When I teach Earth 102, which is the environmental geology class, when I teach it each quarter, there are 2 sections each with 200 students, so 400 students, and many of those students are they're not earth science majors, and they're non-scientists. They're coming from other kind of departments, but interested in kind of in the environment and also satisfying some university requirements.
Thank you for that. Okay, so the last question we had was actually from a student who wanted to know, like, where should they look if they want to know more about what's in their local water?
Yeah, great question. So this is the question that is really kind of governs my work, and it's challenging because there are lots of different ways that people access water. So you might get your water from a kind of municipal supply, which is kind of city water that's piped to your house. You might get water from a well in the back, and those could have very different types of kind of potential contaminants in it. If you're getting water from the municipal side, there are reports that they'll put out, often quarterly, about the quality of the water and any times that there have been infractions. If you have well water, it's less regulated, and so it's sometimes if you purchase a property, you might get a well test, or if you install a well newly, you might get a well water quality test. But in reality, people generally don't know, so you need to take a water sample and send it to a water testing lab to get it tested for different types of things. Within these tests, there are kind of standard contaminants that are often looked for. But another challenge is there are thousands of contaminants, and so how do you test for all of those? Typically, we look for specific indicator contaminants to give a sense of whether there might be threats to that water quality. And how often do you do it? That's another question, depending on whether you use municipal water or well water as well.
Thank you for that. That is all the time that we have for questions. For you students who are watching, thank you so much for your time with us this afternoon. We're looking forward to seeing the reflections that you will submit on this session on community.uoregon.edu. If you have questions about this or any other introduction program, please visit our website, orientation.uoregon.edu. I encourage you to, while you're on our website, to click on the Next Steps link, which is in the top navigation of that page. There you will find a list of items and steps that are part of your preparation for fall term and important for you to begin to make sure that you're completing. You can email your questions to us at orientation@uoregon.edu or text us at 541-346-1159. Again, thank you for watching with us today, and to you, Dr. Polizzotto, thank you so much for helping our new ducks prepare for fall term.
It's a pleasure to be here.